Hey everyone, welcome back to Sleepless Survivors. I'm your host, and tonight we're exploring one of humanity's most enduring nightmares. Forget haunted houses and abandoned asylums. Tonight, we're descending into something far worse, the lair of a dragon. And not just any dragon. We're talking about what happens when you're trapped underground with an ancient, intelligent, fire-breathing predator that sees you as nothing more than a snack with legs. Before we journey into the absolute depths of medieval terror, hit that subscribe button. And I genuinely mean it. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive into historical horror and survival scenarios, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see who's joining us from around the world, at whatever unholy hour you're tuning in. Now dim those lights, maybe brew some coffee because you won't be sleeping after this, and let's descend into a dragon's lair together. You wake up in darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of your bedroom, not the gentle darkness of a summer night. This is the darkness that exists before light was invented, before hope, the kind of darkness that weighs on you like a physical force. Your eyes adjust slowly, so slowly you start to wonder if they ever will. Eventually shapes emerge. Stone. Nothing but stone. Cold, ancient stone that's been here longer than your entire bloodline has existed. The walls around you glisten with moisture. Moisture that smells like sulfur and something else. Something organic. Something that's been burning for a very, very long time. Congratulations. You're lost in a dragon's lair. Part 1. The Descent. The journey down. Let's rewind a moment. How did you get here? Maybe you were an adventurer. Maybe you were a knight sent to slay a dragon that had been terrorizing a kingdom for years. Maybe you were a scholar searching for ancient treasures rumored to be hidden in the beast's hoard. Or maybe, and this is most likely, you made a catastrophically bad decision. You entered the cave knowing the danger. Everyone in the kingdom knew about the dragon. They told stories about it in taverns, whispered warnings in market squares, and carved warnings on stones at the base of the mountain. Turn back, they said. Death awaits, they said. But you didn't listen. Perhaps you were brave. Perhaps you were foolish. The distinction you're learning is mostly academic when you're this far underground. The entrance to the lair had been massive, a gaping mouth of stone and shadow that seemed to swallow the sunlight itself. You descended carefully at first, torches held high, your weapon drawn. The passage started wide and relatively gentle, stone steps carved, or perhaps worn by centuries of use. By what exactly you tried not to think about. But then the passages narrowed. The friendly torchlight began to feel inadequate. Shadows pooled in corners like living things. The temperature rose, not gradually, all at once, as if you'd crossed an invisible threshold from the world of the living into something altogether different. The air became thick, almost gelatinous. Each breath coated your throat with a fine ash that tasted like metal and burning. Your eyes watered, your lungs complained, but you pushed forward because turning back now meant admitting defeat to an entire kingdom, meant admitting that all those warnings might have been right. The passage opened into a cavern. No, a cathedral. A vast underground cathedral carved by nature and enlarged by something far more intentional. Massive columns of stone rose into darkness. Your torch couldn't reach the ceiling. It might not have had a ceiling. It might have just gone up and up until it met the night sky itself, a pillar of emptiness reaching towards stars you'd never see again. And then you saw it. The hoard. Gold. Mountains of gold. Coins and cups and crowns and statues all piled in careless magnificence. Jewels the size of your head, silver platters, armor, lots of armor, much of it dented and stained with what might have been rust or might be something far more unpleasant. Weapons, books with covers of dragon skin, scrolls written in languages that probably shouldn't exist, and bones, scattered throughout the hoard like punctuation marks. Human bones, animal bones, some bones so large you couldn't identify them. The hoard of a dragon isn't just treasure, it's a graveyard. It's a monument to everything the creature has consumed over centuries of appetite. You stepped forward slowly, trying to move quietly, though quiet felt pointless in such a massive space. Sound just echoed back at you, mocking your attempt at stealth. That's when you saw the eyes. Two enormous eyes, each the size of a wagon wheel, opened in the darkness above the horde. They weren't bloodshot or wild. They were intelligent, ancient, aware. They'd been watching you since the moment you entered the cavern, maybe since the moment you entered the mountain, maybe since you first decided to come here, as if the dragon's awareness extended beyond space and time, encompassing every foolish human who'd ever contemplated this particular suicide mission. The dragon stirred, and when it did, everything changed. The beast. Describing a dragon is like describing infinity. Where do you even start? Its body was serpentine, muscular beyond measure, covered in scales that overlapped like armor plates. Each scale was the size of a shield, and they glinted with an oily iridescence that seemed to shift from ruby red to deep black to sickly green, depending on how you looked at it. Its hide was ancient, scarred. They were marks where weapons had struck it, swords that had embedded themselves and been burned out, leaving cauterized divots. There were claw marks from other dragons, perhaps, or maybe from creatures so large and terrible that you'd never even heard of them. The creature's head was angular, almost elegant in its terrifying way. A long snout filled with teeth that weren't uniform like humans, but varied wildly in size and shape, each one a surgical instrument of death. Its nostrils were vents, wide and perpetually smoking. Actual smoke drifted from them continuously, as if the dragon's very breath was too hot to remain invisible. Steam curled from the edges of its mouth, where saliva sizzled against the heat of its own internal temperature. But the claws were what made your knees weak. 4 massive limbs, each one as thick as an ancient oak tree, ended in claws that could have disemboweled a horse with a casual swipe. The claws were curved and wicked sharp, and they clicked against the stone floor as the dragon shifted its enormous bulk, raising its head and looking at you directly. Its eyes weren't just large, they were deep. Looking into them felt like falling into a well that had no bottom, a well that went down through layers of cruel intelligence, centuries of predatory patience, and something almost like contempt. Dragons, if the old texts were to be believed, didn't see humans the way humans saw other animals. They saw them the way humans saw bacteria. Smaller, simpler, fundamentally uninteresting except as a momentary distraction or food source. The dragon's wings, folded against its back like a bat's, rustled when it moved. Each wing was a vast membrane of leathery skin, supported by bone structures as thick as tree trunks. When they fully unfurled, they blocked out whole sections of the cavern space, creating shadows deeper than the surrounding darkness. And then it opened its mouth. A plume of flame erupted into the cavern, not at you, but near you, a warning or a greeting. The heat was so intense it singed the hair on your face and arms. The smell of sulfur and burned stone filled the space. The air itself seemed to shimmer and distort. Small rocks on the ground began to crack from the temperature differential. A piece of driftwood that someone had left behind centuries ago ignited spontaneously and burned to ash. You understood in that moment what medieval knights must have understood when they discovered that slay the dragon was significantly more complicated than the ballads suggested. You understood why so many of them had failed, why so many of their bones were scattered around you in the horde. The dragon didn't roar. It did something worse. It laughed. An actual guttural, knowing laugh that echoed through the cavern and seemed to vibrate in your very bones. It was the laugh of a creature that had been doing this for centuries. The laugh of something that had already won before you even arrived. Part 2. Lost in the Depths. The first hours. Time moves differently in a dragon's lair. Without sunlight, without the regular rhythm of day and night, your internal clock becomes unreliable. Minutes feel like hours. Hours feel like minutes. You lose track. Maybe you've been down here for 3 hours. Maybe it's been 3 days. There's no way to know. After the dragon's display of dominance, the flame, the laughter, it actually did something far more terrifying than attacking you. It ignored you. It settled back into the horde, curling its massive tail around itself, and went to sleep. Or pretended to. You weren't entirely sure which, and that ambiguity was its own special kind of torture. You realized quickly that you couldn't go back the way you came. The dragon was positioned directly between you and the main entrance, blocking the passage with its enormous body. And even if you somehow got past it, which seemed cosmically unlikely, what then? You'd climb down here on ropes, and by scrambling through increasingly narrow passages, climbing back up with an angry dragon in pursuit would be suicide. So, you were trapped. A simple fact, stated clearly. You were trapped. The cavern was massive, as we've established, but it was also cramped. Filled with the horde, it had limited navigable space. The dragon's sheer bulk meant you had to move around it, careful not to wake it or attract its attention. You began to explore the lair's edges, moving slowly along the perimeter of the cavern. The first thing you noticed was the smell. It's hard to overstate. Imagine the worst thing you've ever smelled. Rotting meat, sulfur, burning hair, animal waste, and multiply it by a factor of 10. Then add the constant heat, which seemed to intensify everything, making scents more pungent, more invasive, more absolutely inescapable. You tried breathing through your mouth. That was worse, because then you could taste it. The second thing you noticed was the warmth. The deeper into the lair you went, the warmer it became. This wasn't uncomfortable warmth. This was oppressive, exhausting warmth, the kind that makes your clothes stick to your skin within minutes. Sweat began pouring off you, and within hours you were dehydrated. Your mouth felt like leather, your lips cracked, your throat became so parched you couldn't swallow without pain. You needed water. The cavern had water, actually. There was an underground stream somewhere. You could hear it, echoing distantly, the sound of running water bouncing off stone walls. You made your way toward it, carefully stepping over bones and treasure, moving as quietly as possible past the sleeping dragon. The stream, when you found it, was both a blessing and a curse. The water was cold, shockingly cold, which was pleasant for approximately 3 seconds. Then you realized it was running warm near the dragon's territory, probably heated by volcanic activity or the dragon's own body temperature. But here, near the cavern's far edge, it was almost cool. Almost refreshing. You drank deeply, cupping the water in your hands. It tasted fine. Actually, it tasted better than fine. It tasted like life, like possibility. That was your first mistake. Within an hour, you felt sick. Your stomach began cramping.
The water looked clean, but cleanliness and safety aren't the same thing. This water had probably sat stagnant in the earth for centuries. It likely contained things that had no names, parasites and bacteria that human stomachs aren't equipped to handle. By the time you realized something was wrong, it was too late. You spent the next several hours violently ill, retching into a corner of the cavern, your body purging the contaminated water and betraying you in the most fundamental way. The act of vomiting in that heat, while dehydrated, only made everything worse. You ended up more dehydrated than before, weaker than before, and now also dealing with an angry digestive system that was actively working against you. The dragon, fortunately, slept through all of this. You were careful to muffle your sounds, pressing your hand against your mouth, trying not to make any noise that might wake it. The last thing you needed was to attract its attention by being vulnerable and sick. Heat and madness. The next problem was heat exhaustion. As hours passed, maybe 12, maybe 24, time was meaningless now. The cumulative effect of the temperature began to break you down. Humans aren't meant to live in these conditions. Your body was trying to cool itself through constant sweating, but the sweat evaporated so quickly in the intense heat that it seemed pointless. Your core temperature began to climb despite yourself. You became increasingly confused. Your thoughts scattered. Simple mental tasks became difficult. You'd start counting something and lose track halfway through. You'd form a plan to escape and then forget it before you could act on it. Hallucinations began creeping in around the edges of your vision. You'd see movement in the shadows that wasn't there. You hear voices calling your name.
This is what they don't tell you about dying slowly. It's not dramatic. There's no final heroic stand. There's just gradually becoming less capable, less coherent, less yourself. Your personality starts to dissolve like salt in water. What's left is just basic animal functions. Breathe, don't get eaten, survive the next minute. You found a relatively sheltered spot near the underground stream, away from the dragon, away from the worst of the heat radiating from the horde, and collapsed there. You weren't asleep exactly. You were in a state between consciousness and unconsciousness, a fever dream of exhaustion and dehydration. At one point, you thought the dragon was talking to you. Its massive head was lowered to your level, and it was saying something in a language that predated human speech. You understood it instinctively, though, the way you understand threat in an animal's growl or comfort in a mother's voice. It was telling you that this was inevitable, that humans always came to the lair thinking they'd be special, thinking their courage or cleverness would matter, but in the end, they all ended up the same way. Broken, forgotten, part of the horde. You understood, in that fevered adult state, that the dragon didn't kill you immediately, not out of mercy, but because watching you slowly deteriorate was more entertaining. You were a shell. The dragon was both predator and audience, watching itself digest you slowly, piece by piece, beginning with your hope and ending with your corpse. The passages beyond. When you finally managed to drag yourself to a more functional state, which is to say, when your body stopped actively betraying you, you realized something. The cavern wasn't a dead end. There were passages leading deeper still. You could see them on the far wall, yawning mouths of darkness leading into the mountain's depths. Maybe there was a way out. Or maybe these passages just led to different parts of the lair. Maybe they led to more hoard chambers, more treasure rooms, each one more dangerous than the last. Maybe they led to somewhere the dragon kept its eggs. Even the thought of that, of encountering baby dragons, which would be smaller but likely no less vicious, was enough to make your blood run cold. But you had to try. Staying in the main cavern meant waiting for the dragon to decide it was bored with you. Meant hoping that it would simply eat you and put you out of your misery, rather than letting you slowly starve or dehydrate. You gathered what supplies you had. Your torch was nearly burned through, and you had no way to replenish it. You had a knife, not much use against a dragon, but it might be useful for other things. You had the clothing on your back, and absolutely nothing else that would help. You approached the passages carefully, your makeshift torch held high. The first one you tried descended deeper, the stone becoming wet and slick. The air got colder, which was pleasant for about 30 seconds before you realized why it was cold. The smell of death increased tenfold. You backed out of that one. The second passage rose gradually, ascending back into the mountain. There was a hint of fresher air coming from that direction, not fresh like the world above, but fresher than the sulfurous miasma of the dragon's main chamber. You followed it. This passage was narrower, which meant you had to walk bent over, your back scraping against the low ceiling. It was also far longer than you expected. You walked for what felt like hours, your torchlight revealing endless stone walls, the occasional skeleton of some unfortunate creature, scratches on the stone that might have been claw marks or might have just been erosion. At one point you heard the dragon roar behind you. The sound echoed through the stone, traveling through the earth itself, shaking loose dust and small pebbles. Your heart nearly stopped. You imagined it awakening, realizing you'd left the main chamber and deciding to hunt you down for entertainment. You began moving faster, less carefully, more panicked. But the roar didn't repeat. Maybe the dragon was just stretching. Maybe it was claiming its territory, as creatures do. You forced yourself to slow down, to breathe, to remember that panic was what would kill you. The passage eventually opened into a smaller cavern. This one was dramatically different from the main chamber. Where the main chamber was filled with hoarded treasure and bones, this one appeared to be a nest. Carved out from the stone was a massive depression in the ground, perhaps 40 feet across and 15 feet deep. The bottom was lined with cloth and leather scraps, probably pieces of unfortunate travelers' belongings, torn apart and woven into a crude sort of bedding. And there, arranged around the nest, were eggs. 4 of them, each one the size of a man, with shells that had a dull metallic sheen. They weren't fought, like you might have expected. They were warm, yes, but not unbearably so. They appeared to be sleeping, which seemed impossible for eggs, but in the presence of a dragon, anything seemed possible. You stayed very still, very quiet, very careful not to disturb anything. You had no idea if the mother dragon knew about this chamber, if she checked on her eggs regularly, if disturbing them in any way would result in something far worse than what you'd already experienced. So you backed out slowly, leaving them undisturbed. The chamber had another passage leading out. This one sloped upward more steeply. Your legs burned as you climbed, muscles screaming, but you pushed forward because the air was definitely getting fresher, cooler. You could almost smell something like outside air, like the world above the mountain. After what might have been 30 minutes of climbing, or might have been 3 hours, time had become completely meaningless. The passage opened into a small cavern, and above, impossibly far above, you saw light. Actual light. Sunlight filtering down through an opening in the mountain's peak. You were so excited you almost shouted. You caught yourself biting down on your hand to keep from screaming, but your heart was pounding. There was a way out. There had to be a way out. Part 3. Between Hope and horror. The climb to nowhere. The light from above was both a gift and a torment. It was close enough to see clearly, but far enough away that reaching it seemed utterly impossible. The stone wall rose straight up for what looked like 100 feet. There were no handholds, no ledges, no chains or ropes, just sheer, smooth stone. Whoever had escaped from this chamber in the past, if anyone ever had, hadn't left any equipment behind. You tried climbing anyway. Your hands found tiny cracks in the stone. Your feet found purchase on the smallest irregularities in the wall's surface. You pulled yourself up, 3 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet. You were making progress. You were actually going to make it. You could see the opening more clearly now. It was a vent or a chimney, a natural passage where stone had fractured centuries ago. Then your hand slipped. You fell. The landing was brutal. You hit stone hard, knocking the wind out of yourself, feeling something in your left shoulder pop with an audible crack. For several seconds, you couldn't breathe. You couldn't think. You could only experience the white-hot pain radiating from your shoulder. When you finally managed to get air back into your lungs, you immediately wished you hadn't. The agony of breathing with a possibly dislocated shoulder was its own special torture. Every expansion of your chest sent electricity down your arm. You lay there on the stone floor for a long time, staring up at that tantalizingly close light, accepting that you weren't going to reach it. Not today, maybe not ever. Your body was disintegrating. Your shoulder was injured. You were exhausted, dehydrated, and running out of time. You dragged yourself back to the entrance of the main chamber, moving slowly to avoid jostling your shoulder. The pain was constant now, a baseline of agony that your body had to filter everything else through. You were becoming less capable with every passing hour. Soon you'd be so broken that moving at all would be impossible. You dragged yourself back to the entrance of the main chamber, moving slowly to avoid jostling your shoulder. The pain was constant now, a baseline of agony that your body had to filter everything else through. You were becoming less capable with every passing hour. Soon you'd be so broken that moving at all would be impossible. You dragged yourself back to the main chamber. As you approached the main chamber, you heard the dragon before you saw it. A wet, crunching sound. The sound of something being eaten. The kind of sound that your brain immediately categorized as "do not investigate," but your desperate need to understand forced you to look. The dragon was eating something. A deer, perhaps, or maybe a boar. Something large and quadrupedal, now missing its head. The creature's blood was pooling in the treasure, turning gold to rust-colored darkness. The dragon was methodical about it, tearing pieces of flesh and swallowing them whole, its jaw unhinging to accommodate chunks that seemed far too large. You pressed yourself against the shadows and didn't move. The dragon's eyes were focused on its meal, apparently oblivious to your presence. But then something happened that made your blood freeze even more than it already was. There was a sound. From deeper in the mountain, from the passage you'd come through, a high-pitched keening, the sound of something young and distressed.
The dragon's head snapped up immediately, blood dripping from its jaws. It released the half-eaten deer and moved toward the sound with surprising grace for something so massive. You realized, with a sinking feeling in your stomach, that one of the eggs must have hatched, and the baby dragon, because that's almost certainly what that sound was calling for help. The mother dragon disappeared into the passage, leaving the chamber unguarded. You should have run. You should have escaped up through the main entrance, should have scrambled up the mountain as fast as your broken body could carry you.
But you didn't. Instead, you crept deeper into the chamber, drawn by morbid curiosity and a growing sense of desperation. You made it to the hoard and began searching frantically. If you were going to get out of here alive, assuming that was even possible, you'd need weapons, real weapons, better than the pathetic knife at your belt. The hoard was so vast and disorganized that finding anything useful took time you didn't have. You grabbed a sword, still stained with ancient blood, its edge dull from centuries of non-use. You found a spear, a shield, a pair of leather bracers that might have offered some protection, though against a dragon, protection seemed to be more psychological than practical. You were reaching for a crossbow when you heard it, a sound that made your blood run cold, the sound of the dragon returning, faster this time. The mother had dealt with whatever crisis had occurred and was coming back. You grabbed the closest weapon, the crossbow, though you had no bolts, and ran for the nearest passage. Not the one leading up, a different one. One that descended, because sometimes going down is the only way to survive. The underground rivers. This passage was different from the others. After the first 100 meters or so, you heard the sound of water. Not a small stream, something bigger, something powerful. The passage opened into a cavern where an enormous underground river flowed. The water was dark, moving fast, carrying with it sediment and debris. The sound was almost deafening, the roar of water echoing through stone. There was a path along the river's edge, relatively narrow but present. You took it, moving away from the dragon's chamber as quickly as your injured shoulder would allow. The path twisted and turned, following the river deeper into the earth. At points, it became so narrow that you had to press yourself against the stone wall to avoid tumbling into the water. And the water was terrifying. It moved with purpose, with a hunger of its own. You could see things tumbling through it, bones, rocks, what might have been a wagon wheel. Anything that fell into that river would be carried away into darkness, into the earth's depths where nothing would ever find it. At one point, the path disappeared entirely, just vanished. The river had undercut the stone, creating a wall of water directly adjacent to the path, with no way forward. You were trapped again. But then you noticed something. There was a ledge above your head, a precarious, narrow ledge that ran along the wall. You could climb up, drag yourself across, and potentially drop down onto the path again on the other side of the gap. It took every ounce of strength you had. Your injured shoulder screamed with every movement. You nearly fell twice, once when a handhold crumbled and sent loose stone cascading down into the river, and once when your foot slipped and you were left dangling by one hand over the water, fighting with everything you had not to look down, not to think about what would happen if you fell. But you made it. You dragged yourself onto the path on the other side, gasping for breath, your whole body trembling. And that's when you noticed the light. In the distance, far down the path, there was a faint glow. Not sunlight, something different. Something greenish and bioluminescent, like fungi or some kind of algae thriving in the damp underground environment. You followed the light. The garden in darkness. The cavern that opened before you was unlike anything you'd seen in the dragon's lair. It was vast, impossibly vast, but unlike the hoard chamber, this one was alive. Fungi covered the walls in patterns that looked almost intentional. Luminescent moss glowed with an otherworldly green light. Strange plants with leaves like silver paper grew in cascading arrangements. The air smelled not of sulfur and death, but of earth and growth and something almost clean. It was like discovering a garden in the depths of hell. Water ran through this cavern too, but here it was clear and cold. It collected in pools and trickled down the walls, supporting an entire ecosystem of underground life. You saw blind fish in the pools, insects the size of your hand, a creature that might have been a newtand but was far too large and strange to be anything you had a name for.
You stumbled into this garden, half convinced you were hallucinating from dehydration and heat exhaustion. But the cool air, the water, the relative normality of the space, it was too real to be a fever dream. You drank from one of the pools, just a small amount at first, testing it carefully. The water was cool and clean, tasting only faintly of minerals. There was no immediate sickness, no cramping. Your body accepted it gratefully. You stayed in that garden for what might have been hours or might have been minutes. You drank more water. You found some of the strange plants and tasted them carefully. They were bitter, but not poisonous, and your stomach eventually accepted them as food. You rested, your body finally beginning to feel slightly less broken. But you knew you couldn't stay. The dragon would search for you eventually. Or not search necessarily, but its territory was vast, and you were small. Eventually, your paths would intersect again. And when they did, you were either going to die or the dragon was. Given the current state of your body, the odds favored death. There was another passage leading out of the garden chamber. This one headed upward, and most importantly, you could feel air moving through it, fresh air, outside air. The passage was steep and cramped, but it led up. That was enough. You climbed. Part 4. The Reckoning. The Confrontation. You emerged from the dragon's lair not at the mountain's peak, but on its side about 3/4 of the way up. The outside air hit you like a revelation. It was cold. Actually cold, a refreshing change from the infernal heat of the lair. It tasted clean. It smelled like pine trees and snow and the world above. You were free. Or so you thought. You didn't realize the dragon could follow you here. You assumed it was too large, too dependent on its underground tunnels and chambers. But dragons are creatures of magic as much as flesh, and limits that should constrain them often don't. You'd only made it 100 meters down the mountainside when you heard it, a roar that shook loose rock falls, that echoed across valleys, that sent every bird within miles fleeing in panic. The dragon emerged from the lair entrance behind you, silhouetted against the dark opening, its wings spread wide. It launched itself into the air. The moment its wings caught the wind, its trajectory changed. It wasn't flying toward you in a straight line. It was maneuvering, adapting, hunting. It was circling to cut off your escape. It was playing with you. You started running, which was stupid, which was pointless. But what else could you do? Your feet pounded down the mountainside, following a loose path between rocks and twisted trees. The dragon's shadow raced across the ground, growing longer, then shorter, then longer again as it circled. You could hear the sound of its wings, a deep, rhythmic thumping like war drums. You could feel the heat of its breath even from a distance. It dove. You threw yourself behind a massive boulder as flame erupted where you'd been standing. The fire was so hot that the rock began to glow. Cracks appeared in its surface from thermal shock. You pressed yourself flat on the ground and tried to make yourself as small as possible. The dragon pulled up, banking hard, preparing for another pass. "Stop!" you shouted, your voice small and desperate. "Stop! I'm not worth this!" The dragon didn't respond with words. Dragons don't speak in human languages, not usually. Instead, it roared again. A sound that contained entire galaxies of rage and contempt. And that's when you understood something. The dragon wasn't hunting you because it was hungry. If it wanted you dead, you'd been dead hours ago. It was hunting you because it viewed your escape as an insult. You'd been in its domain. You'd survived its territory. You'd found the sacred places, the egg chamber, the hidden garden, and now you were trying to leave without permission. The dragon saw this as rebellion. And dragons do not tolerate rebellion. You had the sword from the horde, the spear, the shield, all of them useless against an aerial predator that existed since before your civilization had invented agriculture. The dragon circled for another pass. This time, instead of fleeing, you stood your ground. You had nowhere else to run. The only way forward was down the mountain, back to the kingdom, back to safety. And the only way to do that was through the dragon.
The dragon dove faster this time. The sound was terrifying. The rush of wind, the scrape of claws on stone, the heat of its breath announcing its arrival before its body did. You thrust the sword upward at the last second. The blade connected. You felt it impact something hard, maybe the dragon's neck, maybe its shoulder. The dragon shrieked, an awful, piercing sound that was somewhere between a scream and a roar. It didn't matter. Your blade was almost certainly too small to cause any real injury to something so large and heavily scaled. But it was enough to distract it. The dragon swerved to avoid a second thrust, and in doing so, its trajectory took you past you instead of into you. Its tail lashed out as it passed, and you raised the shield. The impact sent you flying backward, crashing into the mountainside hard enough to knock the wind from your lungs. But it also meant you were still alive. You gasped for breath, fighting through the pain, and looked up to see the dragon circling again for another pass. Then you heard something. Horns. Human horns, coming from down the mountain, the direction of the kingdom. The dragon heard them too. Its head swiveled toward the sound, and its body language changed. The casual predator play stopped. For a moment, you glimpsed something in the dragon's demeanor. Not fear exactly, but calculation, assessment. A knight on horseback appeared around the bend below, followed by another, then another. An entire company of soldiers riding hard, carrying lances and swords and determination. They'd been dispatched from the kingdom when you didn't return. They'd come to rescue you, or, more likely, to verify that you were dead and give you a funeral. And now, they were witnessing a dragon. For a long moment, everything froze. The soldier stared at the dragon stared at the soldiers. You sat on the mountainside, bleeding and broken, watching the exact moment when the dragon's assessment shifted. There were too many humans. Even a dragon, despite its power, probably didn't want to engage with organized military force when it was already damaged and dealing with hunger on this one human who had become an absolute nuisance. The dragon turned away from you. It beat its wings powerfully, gaining altitude. Within seconds, it had cleared the mountainside entirely and was flying back toward its lair. You watched it until it disappeared into the clouds, a speck of darkness swallowed by sky. You were alive. Against every rational expectation, against everything you thought you knew about the world and probability and basic fairness. You were alive. Part 5. Aftermath. The return. The descent down the mountain took hours. Your body was so broken that you had to be helped by the soldiers, supported between them as they moved carefully down loose stone and twisted terrain. Every step was agony. Every breath was painful. But you were moving toward something approximating safety, toward warmth, toward people. The kingdom's castle appeared below as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, you allowed yourself to believe you might actually survive this. The journey back took 3 days. You were placed in a cart, and the soldiers moved carefully, aware that any rough movement might aggravate your injuries beyond repair. Your shoulder was bound tightly, your wounds cleaned and bandaged with whatever supplies the soldiers had. It wasn't medical care so much as damage control. Somewhere during the second day, fever set in. The contaminated water from the dragon's lair had done its work, and your body began fighting the infection with everything it had. You drifted between fever dreams and harsh reality, unable to distinguish between what was memory and what was hallucination. You dreamed of the dragon. In the dreams, it wasn't pursuing you, it was talking to you, explaining something ancient and important about the nature of power and territory and what it meant to be prey. The dreams felt more real than waking. By the time you reached the castle, you weren't even conscious anymore. The healers took one look at you and immediately sequestered you in a room away from the rest of the castle, not from cruelty, but from fear. They'd never seen someone return from the dragon's lair. They didn't know if you were contagious. They didn't know what the heat and poison and trauma might have done to you. For 3 days, you existed in a space between life and death. Your fever spiked to dangerous levels. The healers applied cool cloths and administered herbs that tasted like bitter earth and despair. You seesawed between delirium and brief moments of clarity where you could see the stone walls of your recovery room and remember exactly where you were and why. On the 4th day, the fever broke.
Part 6. Bearing Witness. The Interrogation. The moment you were stable enough to speak, the king's advisors began their interrogation. They had questions. So many questions. They needed to know everything about the dragon, its size, its strength, its vulnerabilities. Could it be killed? Should they attempt to slay it? Should they perhaps attempt to negotiate? You told them what you knew, which was simultaneously everything and nothing. You described the heat, the passages, the horde. You described the dragon's intelligence, the way it looked at you with contempt. You described the eggs in the sacred chamber. You described the garden in the depths, where life still somehow thrived. The advisors took notes. They asked follow-up questions. They seemed to be assembling a tactical assessment of the dragon as a military target. You wanted to tell them to stop. You wanted to explain that no amount of planning or soldiers or strategy would matter. The dragon wasn't something you could strategize against. It was an element, like fire or storm. It simply existed, and humans either accommodated it or died. But you kept quiet. You were still weak. Your authority was based on having survived, not on being right. The public welcome. Word spread through the kingdom quickly. A survivor. Someone had gone into the dragon's lair and come back alive. Suddenly you were famous. Local heroes are always valuable, and you had achieved something that no one in living memory had accomplished. You'd entered the dragon's territory and escaped to tell about it. The king arranged a public ceremony. You were dressed in fine clothes, the first clean, undamaged garments you'd worn in what felt like forever. Your wounds were hidden beneath silk and leather. You looked almost healthy, almost heroic, almost like someone who'd fought a dragon and won. But it felt hollow, because the truth was more complex than the ballad could capture. You hadn't defeated the dragon. You had survived the dragon, which is a fundamentally different thing. You'd succeeded not through heroism, but through luck, persistence, and the dragon's ultimate indifference to whether you lived or died. The physical recovery. The weeks following your return were brutal in different ways than the lair had been.
Your shoulder required multiple treatments to regain functionality. The healer, an old woman with gentle hands and a vast knowledge of bone and muscle, worked with you daily, moving your arm through increasingly painful ranges of motion. Every session was torture, designed to keep the joint from seizing up permanently. By the end of each session, you were usually weeping from pain. Your digestive system never fully recovered. Foods that used to be pleasant now made you ill. Your stomach had been permanently altered by whatever parasites or bacteria you'd ingested. You could eat, but your relationship with food had become fraught. Every meal was a negotiation between hunger and fear. The nightmares began immediately and showed no signs of stopping. Every night you woke drenched in sweat, your heart hammering, convinced you were back in the dragon's lair. Sometimes you could remember what you'd been dreaming about. Other times the dreams evaporated the moment you woke, leaving only the residual terror and the certainty that something terrible had occurred. The castle's healers offered herbs to help you sleep, potions mixed with moonflower and valerian and things they wouldn't name. You tried them for a while. They helped with sleep, but they also filled your dreams with pharmaceutical haze, and you'd wake more exhausted than before. Eventually, you stopped trying to sleep deeply. You learned to nap, to exist in a state of semi-consciousness that was never quite restful, but was at least predictable. Part 8. The Weight of Knowledge. What you learned. Surviving the dragon taught you things that peacetime had never quite managed to convey. You learned that comfort is temporary, that the world is actively hostile to human life, that civilization is a thin veneer over chaos, and that beyond the walls of the kingdom, older and darker things still ruled.
You learned that death isn't noble or meaningful. It's indifferent. The dragon hadn't spared you because you were worthy or brave. It had spared you because you weren't interesting anymore. Because hunting soldiers approaching was more of an immediate threat than one injured human on the mountainside. You learned that heroes don't exist. There are only survivors and the dead. The survivors are the ones who happened to make the right choices, or more often, got lucky enough to survive the wrong ones. You learned that the stories people told themselves about you were more important than the truth. Everyone wanted you to be a hero, because heroes made sense. Heroes proved that courage and skill mattered. If you told them the truth, that you'd survived mostly through terror and desperation and the simple fact that you hadn't died, they didn't want to hear it. The strange compulsion. Months passed. Your shoulder healed. Your stomach gradually learned to tolerate more foods. The nightmares became slightly less frequent, occurring only 4 or 5 times a week instead of every night. But something odd began to happen. You found yourself thinking about the lair, about the passages, about the garden in the darkness, about the dragon itself. Not as traumatic memories, though those were part of it, but as something else, as a puzzle you hadn't solved, as a place you'd left unfinished. People noticed you becoming distant. You'd stop mid-conversation, stare at nothing. You'd catch yourself tracing the shape of dragon scales on whatever surface was available. Stone, dirt, table. You'd find yourself studying maps, trying to recall the exact location of the mountain. One of the castle's advisors pulled you aside and asked directly if you were considering returning to the lair. The question was asked carefully, like someone asking if you were considering jumping off a cliff. Everyone knew you'd be insane to go back. Everyone knew it was suicide. But were you considering it? You didn't know. The honest answer was that part of you wanted to return. Part of you needed to return. There was something unresolved about the experience, something incomplete about simply escaping.
You'd left the dragon alive. Wounded, maybe, but alive. And you'd left the eggs unhatched. You'd left the garden undisturbed. You'd retreated and sealed the mountain with your silence, pretending it was conquered when in fact you'd simply admitted defeat and fled. The second ascent. It was early winter when you decided to go back. You didn't announce it. You didn't ask for permission or support or advice. You simply gathered supplies quietly. Rope, better weapons than before, water, dried food. You filled the pack and left the castle one night, heading north toward the mountain. The journey took 3 days. The terrain was familiar this time, but no less treacherous. You reached the base of the mountain and began climbing, not following the same path you'd used before, but scouting new approaches. If you were going back in, you wanted options. You wanted exits. You found the entrance to the lair, the gaping mouth of stone just as you remembered it. The air coming from it still smelled of sulfur and ancient fire, but now you were prepared. Now you understood what awaited you. You took a breath and descended. The main chamber was exactly as you'd left it. The hoard glinted in your torchlight, untouched. The bones were still scattered where they'd fallen, and there was no sign of the dragon. You explored more carefully this time, with less panic and more purpose. You mapped the passages mentally, understanding the lair's layout now in ways you hadn't before. You retraced your steps to the egg chamber and found that one of the 4 eggs had hatched. The remaining 3 were still dormant, still waiting for the day when they'd emerge into a world that was probably far more crowded than it had been when they were laid. You left an offering at the nest, a small statue you bought, something valuable, something respectful, an acknowledgement of territory that didn't belong to you. You descended to the underground river and followed it deeper, exploring passages you didn't have time to investigate on your first journey. You found bones of creatures that had no names in human languages. You found underground lakes so pristine and beautiful that they almost broke your heart. You found things that suggested other people had come here before, ancient tools, scratches on walls that might have been letters in long-dead alphabets. And then you found the treasure chamber that didn't belong to the dragon. It was small by comparison to the main hoard, but it was unmistakably intentional. Arranged neatly on stone shelves were items that told a story of someone else, someone who'd lived in these depths long before the dragon arrived. Books, most of them crumbled to dust, weapons, armor, personal effects, and a journal, miraculously preserved, its leather cover still intact. You opened it carefully and read the faded handwriting of someone who'd lived in these caves, a scholar or wizard maybe, who documented their understanding of the dragon. The journal entries spanned decades. They described the dragon's patterns, its migration routes, its preferences in food and territory. They described attempts to communicate with it, experiments that had gone catastrophically wrong. The final entry, dated what must have been a century or more ago, read simply, "The dragon is not our enemy. The dragon is the mountain's oldest inhabitant. We are merely guests, and guests who have overstayed their welcome." You understood then what you'd been missing. The dragon wasn't evil or cruel. It was territorial and predatory, yes, but it wasn't cruel. It was living in the only way it knew how, defending the only home it had ever known. And you'd invaded that home, had violated its sacred chambers, had threatened its eggs. The dragon had been remarkably patient, actually. The encounter. You were leaving the scholar's chamber when you encountered the dragon again. This time, it didn't attack. It simply emerged from the shadows and regarded you with eyes that were far too intelligent, far too aware. You stood perfectly still, not out of fear, though fear was present, but out of respect. This was its territory, its home. You were here on sufferance. The dragon lowered its head slightly. Not a gesture of aggression, more like an acknowledgement, an understanding. And then it did something extraordinary. It spoke. Not in words exactly, but in a language that existed somewhere between sound and thought, communicated through vibrations that traveled through your bones. It told you to leave. Not violently, not angrily, just simply, your presence was noted, your boldness was recognized, but you needed to go. This was not a place for humans. This was the dragon's domain, and it would tolerate your intrusion only so far before its patience thinned wear. You bowed, actually bowed, dropping to one knee, your head bent, and turned to leave. You didn't run, you didn't panic. You walked calmly back through the passages you'd come through, retracing your steps toward the world above. Behind you, the dragon didn't follow. It simply watched, a pair of enormous eyes in the darkness, until you'd passed entirely out of sight. Part 8. The Final Reckoning. The truth you bring back. When you emerged from the mountain, the sun was setting again, painting the world in gold and shadow. You felt different than you had months ago. Changed, settled somehow. You descended the mountain slowly, taking your time, understanding now that there was no hurry. What would happen would happen. The dragon would be fine. The kingdom would be fine. Life would continue in its messy, complicated glory. The kingdom's scouts found you 2 days later, wandering the foothills, looking lost and purposeful at the same time. They brought you back to the castle, where you were immediately surrounded by advisors demanding reports. What did you find? Had you seen the dragon? Was it still alive? Was it still a threat? You told them the truth. You told them that yes, the dragon was alive. Yes, it was still dangerous, but no, it wasn't a threat. Not to the kingdom, not if the kingdom left it alone. The advisors were confused. The king was disappointed. He'd been preparing for a military expedition, had been gathering forces and resources. The idea that the dragon problem might just exist as a permanent condition was not an acceptable answer to them. But that was the truth. That was the only truth that mattered. The dragon existed, it would continue to exist, and humans had to learn to live.
The years after, life settled into a strange rhythm after that. You never fully recovered from your injuries. Your shoulder ached during storms. Your stomach remained temperamental. The nightmares continued, though less frequently now. But you learned to live with all of it. You learned that damage was part of the human condition, that broken things didn't have to be fixed to be whole. You kept the scholar's journal in your private quarters, hidden from the king and his advisors. You read it periodically, finding new understanding in each passage. The scholar had left maps, detailed descriptions of the Lair's layout. Over time, your own memories, combined with the journal's documentation, created a complete picture of the dragon's kingdom. Sometimes travelers would come through the kingdom, having heard stories of the mountain and the dragon and the one human who'd survived. They'd seek you out, wanting you to confirm the legends, wanting to hear the dramatic version of events that the bards had created. You'd tell them what they wanted to hear, but you'd always end the same way. Go home. Don't go to the mountain. The dragon isn't a problem to solve. It's a reality to accept. Some listened. Many didn't. The mountain claimed a few wanderers every year. Treasure hunters and thrill seekers, and desperate people looking for answers. The dragon usually killed them quickly. Sometimes, if they were lucky, not. You knew the dragon's territory had expanded slightly over the years. New passages had opened. The horde had grown. There were occasionally new skeletal remains in the main chamber. Life and death continued their eternal dance, with the dragon at the apex. And you lived. The lesson. Years later, an old scholar came to the kingdom and sought you out specifically. She'd heard the stories and had traveled far to meet the survivor, to ask you directly what the experience had taught you. You sat with her in the castle's library, surrounded by books, and tried to articulate something that resisted articulation. It taught me, you said slowly, that the world is much larger than we pretend it is, that there are places where humans don't belong, where we have no dominion, and that respecting those boundaries isn't weakness, it's wisdom. The scholar nodded thoughtfully. Do you regret going? No, you said, but I've regretted staying away since. There's unfinished business in that mountain. Will you return again? I don't know. Part of me wants to. Part of me knows that eventually the dragon's patience will run out. I violated its sanctuary twice now. A third time might be one too many. Do you fear the dragon? I thought about the enormous eyes in the darkness, about the heat of its breath, about the moment it had lowered its head and spoken to me across the gulf of species and understanding. No, I said finally. I respect it. That's much more important than fear. And the legacy. When you eventually died, decades later, in a warm bed, surrounded by people who cared about you, your will specified that the scholar's journal be preserved in the kingdom's library, accessible to future researchers. You also left behind a detailed map of the dragon's lair, as accurate as memory and subsequent study could make it. Over time, your maps and journals became legendary in their own right. Scholars debated their accuracy. Adventurers used them to plan their own expeditions. Some succeeded in reaching the lair. Most didn't return. The dragon, for its part, seemed to become more reclusive as time passed. The sightings decreased. The stories took on a mythical quality. Eventually, people began to wonder if the dragon had ever existed at all, or if it was simply a metaphor for the mountain itself, for the wild places that resisted human conquest and control. But you knew better. You'd felt its presence. You'd heard it speak in vibrations that resonated through your bones. You'd seen intelligence and age and the weight of centuries in its eyes. The dragon existed. It existed beyond the kingdom's maps, beyond human understanding, beyond the reach of civilization. And in existing, it taught the world a simple truth, that there were powers that humans could not overcome, places that humans could not conquer, and that acceptance of those limits was not defeat, it was maturity.
The final message. Before you died, you gave one final interview to a young scholar who reminded you of yourself as a younger person, curious, desperate to understand the world, willing to listen rather than judge. What would you tell someone today, they asked, if they asked whether they should attempt to reach the dragon's lair? You smiled, a sad, knowing smile that came from decades of living with the consequences of your choices. I'd tell them that the dragon's lair exists for a reason, that the world needs mysteries, needs places where humans don't belong, needs boundaries that we respect rather than conquer. I'd tell them that true courage isn't going where you've been told not to go. True courage is accepting that some mountains should remain unclimbed, some caves should remain unexplored, and that the dragon deserves its solitude. But you went, the scholar pointed out. I did, and I survived. But I paid the price for it. My shoulder never healed properly, my stomach never recovered, I had nightmares for decades, and most importantly, I came to understand something that I wish I'd known when I was young and foolish and thought courage and foolishness were the same thing. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is turn around and go home. The scholar left thoughtful, and you never saw them again, but you hoped your words had planted something, a seed of wisdom perhaps, or at least the beginning of understanding that heroism isn't always about fighting dragons. Sometimes it's about knowing when to leave them alone. Centuries after your death, the dragon's lair remains largely unchanged. The horde continues to grow, new eggs are laid and hatched, the underground garden thrives in its pocket of perpetual darkness.
The ancient river still flows through stone passages no human has fully mapped. And the dragon, ageless and patient, continues its existence in the depths, tending its domain, raising its young, accumulating its treasure. It doesn't think about the humans who occasionally venture into its territory. It doesn't pine for the surface world or the sky. It simply exists, generation after generation, the apex predator of its realm, the master of the mountain. Every so often, a scholar or adventurer manages to penetrate the outer chambers of the lair. They return with stories and maps and claims that they've seen the dragon. The kingdom listens, takes notes, and collectively decides that nothing needs to be done about it, because you taught them something valuable. Sometimes the most important thing civilization can do is set boundaries. Not boundaries it imposes on the world, but boundaries it respects. Places where nature still rules, where power still flows from ancient things, where humans are the visitors and everything else is home. The dragon's lair exists as a reminder of that lesson, and in existing, it serves its purpose. It teaches humans that they are not the center of the world, that they are not supreme, and that there is profound power in accepting that some mysteries should remain unsolved, some dragons should remain undisturbed, and some mountains should keep their secrets. You learned that, and in learning it, in bearing witness to it, you change not just your own life, but the kingdom's understanding of the world. That was the true treasure you brought back from the dragon's lair. Not gold or jewels or the answers to ancient riddles, but wisdom, the understanding that the world is large enough for humans and dragons both, and that respecting that balance is the only way either can survive. The dragon remains in the depths, the mountain keeps its secrets, and the kingdom, having learned from your experience, continues forward into a world where some things are meant to stay mysterious. And somehow, that's enough. It's enough for the dragon, it's enough for the mountain, and in the end, it was enough for you too. And that's the story of what happens when you're lost in a dragon's lair. Not a story of triumph or victory or conquest, a story about learning to accept limits, about understanding that some places don't belong to us, and that's okay. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into survival, territory, and the monsters we should leave alone. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark and mysterious, please subscribe to Sleepless Survivors. Leave a comment telling me about your own experiences with things that terrified you and what you learned from surviving them. Sleep well. And remember, sometimes the best adventure is knowing when to come home. I'm your host, and I'll see you next time on Sleepless Survivors. Stay safe out there.